To the lesson, let me just say we want to see you Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. We want you to come and be here in person. If you're physically unable, and by physically unable, I'm not saying just too lazy to get out of bed. I'm saying if you're physically unable, if you're sick, if there's something out of state or whatever, but you're physically unable to be here, watch us online. We'll be on YouTube and our Facebook page. Let me encourage you to watch the YouTube if you can. Our YouTube address, our channel is Newcastle FWB Church. And if you can watch that on YouTube, I'm told it's a better quality picture. So if you can't watch it on YouTube, watch it on Facebook. But we want you to join us and be with us for our morning worship service. Sunday morning, 11 o'clock, here live. That's barring a bunch of snow or ice or something, of course. And if we do have snow and ice, be careful. If you feel safe enough getting out and coming, then come. I intend to be here unless I'm sick or ill or something, and I'm planning on being here. But if you don't feel safe, stay home and watch online. That's weather related. So we'll talk more about that later date and as time comes by. I don't think there's anything forecast for this weekend, so as far as bad weather. So hopefully there's not. But we want you to join us. Let's go to the Lord in prayer, then we'll get into our lesson. How's that sound? Father in heaven, we do thank you so much for all of your blessings. Thank you for giving us your word and the example of the Apostle Paul of how we should live and act, and help us to take these words and learn from them and live like you would have us to live. Be with us as we go through this study. Touch our hearts and our lives. Draw us to you. And I pray that when this is over, that you will look at us, we will look at it and say, God is really speaking to my heart. I hope that's what we all say, Lord. So be with us. In Jesus' name we ask it all. Amen. Have you ever gone through a difficult time in your life, something that you had to face, or maybe somebody you know had to face this really, really difficult place, and in the middle of it all, God gave them the grace and the strength to get through that difficulty? Has that been you? Someone you know? Well, let me ask you, how did God use it for good? I've been through several places like that in my life. And as I was studying this, one that came up in my mind was a few years ago. I had a stomach bleed several years ago. I had a stomach bleed and I was losing blood and I didn't know what was happening. And it was bad enough that I ended up in the emergency room. They rushed me up to run a light down my throat and everything. And I was so weak, and I'm not getting into the whole story, but anyway, I was so weak. But I remember as they pushed me up and got me ready to take me into where they could go in and put me out and go in and look down into my stomach to see what was going on. The thought crossed my mind. We're always wondering, what's going to happen. And the thought crossed my mind. This is all in God's hands. If he wants to take me home to be with him in heaven right now, I'm ready. And if not, then he'll see me through it. And when that thought hit my mind, the peace of God that I cannot describe came over me all at once. It's an indescribable peace, knowing that I'm in God's hands and it's all going to be great one way or the other. However it works out, it's going to be great. Well, obviously he didn't take me home because I'm still here. But he saw me through it. He gave me that peace. And by the way, what's really interesting is that at that exact same time, Melanie was not with me. She was down in another part in a waiting room waiting to see what happened. And as we talked about it later, at that exact same time, that same peace came to her. Peace that only God can give. Well, that's just one example of many, many examples in my life. Maybe you have one too. Maybe it's something totally different. But the fact is that all of us go through times of weakness or times of difficulties in our lives. But God can use those weaknesses and difficulties to help us through and make us stronger and make us better people for our good. Well, as we get into 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul, the apostle, is defending his authority. There are false teachers and a group called Judaizers who were going around attacking his ministry. Some of them were legalists who taught that in order for a person to really be saved, they had to keep the law of Moses. Isn't it amazing how people do things like that even today? They say if you're really going to be saved, you've got to do this. You've got to have that spiritual gift, and you've got to do this other thing, or you only have to use this one particular translation of the Bible. Or, I mean, people come up with all kinds of bogus things to attack other people who are trying to preach and teach and live for the word, live the way God would have them to live. Well, in Paul's day, they were telling people they had to keep the ceremonial laws of Moses in order to really be saved. And so Paul, in doing so, they were attacking Paul and attacking his ministry. So he had to defend his ministry. He started earlier than this, and he continued it on through chapter 12. But the point that we need to understand today, and you'll see this as we go along, rather than Paul lifting himself up, rather than Paul bragging on himself, he exalted the Lord through all of this. And that brings us to the first key truth of our lesson and that is that as believers, as Christians, we should seek to exalt God, not ourselves. I know of Christians who go around bragging, I did this and I did that, and look at what I've done. I know preachers like that, don't you? Look at my accomplishments. Look at the size of my church. Look at, we had this many decisions, this many bad. Folks, it's good that God's blessing and you're having decisions and baptisms and all kinds of things like that. But it's not you that's doing it. God is the one who deserves all of the credit and all of the glory. He deserves it. The Apostle Paul had a lot of reasons to brag and boast about his life, about his ministry experiences. No other apostle had been called to follow Christ the same way that the Apostle Paul was. He had received also extraordinary visions. We know of it. There is no one else that we know of except the Apostle John in the book of Revelation. By the way, share a little pet peeve of mine. A lot of people call that the book of Revelations, plural. That's wrong. It is revelation. It's one revelation that God gave the Apostle John. So it's the book of Revelation, not Revelations. It's a pet peeve of mine. That doesn't mean you're not going to go to heaven if you say Revelations, but it's just one of my pet peeves. But anyway, let me get back on the lesson. Those two, the Apostle Paul, the Apostle John, are the only ones that we know of that God allowed to see a little glimpse of heaven. Most of us would have used something like that to say, look at me. Wow, I'm privileged. I got to do this and I got to do that. Well, let me tell you something, folks. It's not something he deserved or earned. It's an honor that God gave him. Just like any position that we have in this world. I might be elected to some board. I might be elected to some office. I might be put as pastor or this office or what. It's not our greatness. It's God that does that. It's God that does that. If any bragging's done, it should be about God, not about what we can do or what we've done. Paul was very careful not to use his experiences to brag about himself. Instead, he always turned the conversation forward toward Christ, focused on Christ. Paul had been forced to defend his ministry as an apostle, but he still kept the attention on Christ. In verse 1, Paul expressed that he must defend his ministry even though there's really nothing to be gained for the church from doing so. He would not continue to do so in an attempt to silence, let me rephrase that. He would continue to do so in an attempt to silence his critics, though. And that was the only reason. Apparently, these critics and these false teachers had criticized his claim as an apostle, criticized his experiences, criticized everything that they could, finding fault in everything they could. You know anybody like that? I think there are a lot of churches that are that have people in them just like that, trying to find fault with everything that happens and everything that goes on. Trying to find fault with everything around them, and in doing so, what they're doing is whether they realize it or not, they may not even realize it, but in doing so, what they're doing is they're trying to make themselves look better. That's what these critics of Paul were doing. Paul's reluctance in sharing these details kind of highlights and brings out the differences between him and the critics. Because what they were doing is they were anxious to get all the pats on the back and the accolades and the honors. And Paul, on the other hand, didn't care about that. He only wanted honor from God. Only God. That was the most important. We need to realize that when we're boasting about our strengths, it's very inappropriate for believers to do so. All of our talents, all of our abilities, anything that we've accomplished, everything has happened, has been given to us by God. You say, well, I worked hard to earn it. God gave you the ability to do so. Everything good that's ever happened to us or that we've accomplished is a gift of God. And God deserves the honor and the glory for all of it. We need to learn to fight the temptation to brag and boast. It's something I've had to learn. It's something we all must learn. To fight the temptation to brag on ourselves or our accomplishments. Well, verse 2. The apostle was speaking here in third person. You know people that have done that. I can't think off the top of my head some famous person that does this. There are several of them, but when they talk about something they've done, let's say their name was, John's a very generic name. Let's just say, as they were talking about something, well, John was able to do this and John did that, talking about themselves. John did this, John did that. Paul wasn't like that. He didn't want that. But Paul, in verse 2, we see, was speaking in third person, and he says, I knew about a man who was given a glimpse of heaven. He was talking about himself. I think it's very possible this was Paul's way of avoiding the temptation to brag on himself and his own experiences. Apparently, this event occurred years before this, and during the period of 14 years before the writing of Corinthians. And there's not a lot that we know about Paul's life during that time. There's a large silent period where Paul was learning and growing, and God was working with him. That's not recorded for us anywhere. It's not that it wasn't important, because it was, but it's just something that we don't know about. We don't need to know about. God's given us everything we need to know in His Word. But he talks about this period in his life, and he talks about the third heaven. Now, the third heaven is a place that he's referring to. That's where the dwelling place of God and the angels are. That's the third heaven. That's what he was talking about here. Twice in verses 2 and 3, Paul expressed the uncertainty of whether he was in the body or out. He didn't know if he actually was transported to heaven in body, or if God just allowed him to feel like he was there and experience it that way. He did not know. Strictly spiritual experience. But whatever the case was, the fact that the experience that Paul had were not intended to be shared with a lot of people. God had given him this experience, and it was not intended to be shared. And that's why he doesn't share a lot of it. He just tells us that it happened. Paul, in verse 5, lets us know that if there was to be any boasting or bragging, he said it's going to be about my weakness. About my weakness. What mattered the most to Paul at this point was the work that God was doing in and through him. Not his achievements. Not what he'd done in the past. If Paul had chosen to boast and brag, it still would have been the truth. But his desire was that no one would put him in a position that he did not deserve, simply because of some experience that he'd had. The only reason for Paul boasting, and should be for our boasting, any that we do, is because we want to glorify Christ and with the sufficiency of Christ in our lives, how God works in our lives, not our experience, not our ability. Brag about how God helps us, even when we are at our weakest. It's called humility. We need to learn to grow in humility. When somebody comes up and starts patting us on the back and telling us how great we are and praising us, we need to learn to shift the spotlight onto God and not onto ourselves. We all, be honest with me now. Be honest with yourself. We all love people to pat us on the back. We all love people to tell us wonderful things about ourselves, acknowledge our accomplishments, but we ought to take those and turn them around to God. To God. That brings us to the second key truth of our lesson, and that is that God sometimes uses difficulties to keep us humble and dependent on Him. Paul's vision of heaven was great. But if it was not kept in its proper perspective, it could have destroyed his earthly ministry. Because God knows our nature and our inclination toward being proud and pride. He often allows great burdens and blessings to be mixed in to our lives. In Paul's case, he had experiences, numerous revelations, most of which we are never told about. And that alone could have given Paul enough reason to become prideful and boast and brag. I mean, anybody who is operating strictly in the flesh, why wouldn't they brag and boast? But God sends or allows both blessings and difficulties in our lives, the purpose of which is for His glory. You might be thinking, how in the world could my difficulties bring glory to God? Stop and think about it. How could they? I shared with you one of the difficulties that I faced. And believe me, it is definitely not the only difficulty I ever faced. God allowed the Apostle Paul to have what he called a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to buffet him, to beat him, to keep him humble, to make sure he continued to rely on God. In the original Greek, the word translated thorn has the idea of something sharp that would cause very severe pain poking into you. You ever have something sticky real hard? I recently had a procedure done, and the doctor had to put me out. But the procedure consisted, I'm not bragging about this, I'm just telling you, the procedure consisted of sticking a bunch of needles in my foot and shooting electricity in it. I had to be put out. That's how severe the pain would have been. Thankfully, it wasn't severe like that, but it was to treat a little thing that I've got going on. But anyway, that happened. And I can just imagine having something sharp sticking in the... You ever been stuck with a needle? Or have a thorn in your finger or your hand? And how it bugs you and how it hurts? And can you imagine having something there constantly, all the time? Well, that's what Paul... We don't know what the thorn was. Most Bible scholars believe it was a physical ailment of some kind. Some believe it may have been something like a physical pain. Some believe it was poor eyesight. We don't know. I've heard some people say, well, it was somebody that went around ahead of him causing problems. Well, that happened anyway. that was not in his flesh, but that's another story. But the fact is that Paul did not have the time or energy to focus or be proud because he was too focused on relying on God to help him with the struggles that he was going through, that he faced daily. The term for messenger is a Greek word that could be translated angel or messenger. This thorn, whatever it was like a messenger sent by Satan to physically harass Paul. Physically harass Paul. When we go through difficulties and problems, it can really keep us humble, can't it? Makes us rely on God to get through. It should anyway. Make us rely on God. Sometimes God allows us to face difficulty to keep us humble and reliant upon Him. We don't like pain. We don't like to suffer. But when it comes, We need to make sure that we don't waste our pain. You say, what do you mean waste your pain? Use it for God's glory. Share God in it. It's kind of interesting that Paul mentioned twice in a single verse that this thorn was given to him to keep him from becoming conceited or exalted or prideful. A lot of lesson, a lot of truths to be found in that lesson there. Believers are not immune to pride or temptation. And we are not immune to challenges, I'll get the word out in a minute, and struggles that we face as humans. But it does show that those struggles and challenges can be a useful thing. Sometimes we need to acknowledge that through our personal faith in God. I'm going to kind of, I'll do it in a minute, what I was thinking about doing. Sometimes we need to identify with temptations. We need to let people know, speak of the challenges that we face. God does not cause bad things to happen. The devil does that. Satan does that. But God does permit them to happen. And when he does, they can and they will accomplish good for the believer. Romans 8:28 is one of my favorite verses of the Bible. And if you don't know that verse, look it up. Romans 8:28. God has used that verse in my life many times. That verse has been a blessing to me. Another verse that goes along with that's Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. God is able to work all things out for our good, for his glory. And whatever Paul was facing as a thorn in the flesh, whatever we might face, we need to understand that God's grace is sufficient to see us through it. Let me just mention this real quickly, and it's what I started to say just a moment ago. There are people out here in the world, Christians, who teach and tell everybody that if you just have enough faith, you'll never have any problems, you'll never be sick, except the sickness that leads to death. They do make one exception there. You'll never have any problems, never be sick, you'll never have any financial problems, you'll never have any difficulties, everything will be smooth. God will just bless you so much that you'll never have a problem in the world. I'm here to tell you that's a bunch of hogwash. If you don't know what that term means, it's a good old Southern term. Hogwash. When you wash a hog, see what comes off of it. But anyway, that's another story. If anybody ever had enough faith to make that happen, it was the Apostle Paul. And if God told him that his grace was sufficient, it ought to be good enough for us too. And understand that there will be times when things happen. There will be times of trouble, trial, difficulties, problems, pain, heartache, that are not caused by a lack of faith. Now, don't get me wrong, we do bring some things on ourselves. If we sin, if we do make bad choices and bad decisions, we bring things on ourselves. That's true. But some things are no fault of our own. They happen. I mean, we face these things. But God gives us the strength and the grace for whatever it is we face. The Apostle Paul told us that he pleaded with God 3 times that it would be taken away from him. And this word plead has the idea of begging, pleading, crying out to God, imploring God earnestly with all of his heart, with everything he had. Please, God, take this away from me. But God said no. If God wouldn't do that for Paul and his faith, why should we think he would do something for us where we never have any problems or difficulties? God did not grant Paul's prayer for the removal of the problem, but he provided something even better, his grace and his strength. The tense of the verb is important in understanding in the original Greek because it could literally read, he has once for all said to me. In other words, the message that the Apostle Paul received from God was the final word. That was it. Regardless, he could take this through his life, regardless of the challenges that he would face. Instead of removing the thorn, God gave grace, unmerited kindness, nothing he deserved or earned, and favor. And that would be sufficient to give him contentment. When we're facing something, folks, God will give us the grace and the strength we need for any difficulty we might face. Further, through Paul's weakness and experience, God's power will be on display for other people to see. Not Paul's own strength, not his own ability, but God's power. And so Paul said, I have to brag about God and his ability and what he has done. The struggle he was going through prompted him to more fully rely on God. And God gave him the grace to make it through the trials that he was there. God does that for us too. Seek him. If you're going through trials, seek him and then realize that he is with you and he will give you the strength. He will give you his grace to see you through it. Somebody once said that God's glory shines the brightest in our weakness. And I think that's what Paul was trying to say here. And that's what we need to see in our lives. It's very clear from verse 10 that God changed Paul's perspective regarding the difficulties of life. The experiences that would naturally make a person, even an apostle, cringe and break through the pressure were now welcome because of the strength of God that could be shown and manifest in and through them. All of these things Paul knew was for Christ's sake and that he could be seen through his strength and his power through the difficulties, helping Paul through it all. We're going to have difficulties in life. We're going to have problems. But we need to let our response to whatever difficulty it is point people to Christ and his strength. Point people to Christ. Thank you for joining us. I look forward to seeing you Sunday morning in church, 11 o'clock. If the weather's bad, which I don't think it's supposed to be, if the weather's bad, join us.